Well, here we all are again. I must say, it does seem like quite an age that we've been away from each other, gathered by the little fireside here. And of course, if it is your first time joining us by the fireside, then an extra special welcome to each of you. Well, I hope you've all had wonderful summers, long days filled with blissful hot sunshine and the like. After all, without the light, we can't really see the shadows, can we? And what particular shadow do I have for you all this evening? Well, I thought tonight that I might talk to you about something of a family heirloom, because there exists at this present moment, in good preservation upon my wall, in fact, a remarkable work by the artist Godfrey Shulkin. Now, its apparent worth is in the curious management of light, as is usual within the chief merit of that artist's milieu. But I say apparent worth, for it is really in this work its subject, not its handling, or however exquisite, that consists its true value. Now, this picture represents an interior chamber scene of some antique religious building or other, and within the foreground there is a female figure placed toward the fore in a species of white robe which hangs about her and forms a veil. Now, it is not of any religious order, at least not one that I know of. Within her hand there is a lamp, and it is by that lamp alone that the figure and the face is illuminated. Her features wear such an arch smile as well becomes a pretty woman given over to some prankish roguery. Within the background, there is a dim red light from a expiring fireside, and in the shadows there stands the figure of a man, and he is dressed in the old Flemish fashion, and he is posing in an attitude of alarm. You see, his hand is upon the hilt of his sword. Now, it appears in the it appears really that the figure is in the act of drawing said sword against some apparent devilish danger. Well, some pictures impress one, I know not how, with the conviction that they represent not just some idle shapes from the painter's imagination, but indeed that they present some true and real scene. Now, within this strange picture, there is something that stamps it as a representation of reality, as a scene that has actually existed. Now, it is a truthful scene, in part, for it faithfully records some remarkable incident that was a mysterious and strange occurrence in Shulkin's life. And it captures, in the face of that female figure toward the fore, in the most prominent place of the design, an accurate portrait of Rose Veldecoust, who was the first, and indeed I may say only, love of Godfrey Shulkin. Now, my great-grandfather, in fact, knew the painter well, and it was from he himself that he learnt the fearful story behind the painting, and it was from him that he received, in fact, the picture itself, which had formed a bequest, and now the picture and indeed the story stay as heirlooms within my family. Having described the painting to you at least somewhat, I will attempt now to relate to you all the tradition that goes along with it, that has descended with the canvas to my hand. How to describe Godfrey Shulkin? There are few forms on which the mantle of romance hangs quite as ungracefully than the uncouth Shulkin. He was a boorish fellow, but a most cunning worker in oils, and his pieces delighted the critics of our day, well, almost as much as his manners disgusted the gentry of his own time. Yet, for a man so rude, so dogged, and so slovenly, even at the height of his celebrity, in his obscure but happier days, he played the hero in a wild romance of some mystery and passion. Now, when Godfrey Shulkin studied under the immortal Gerard Doe, he was a young man, and in spite of his phlegmatic temperament, he fell head over ears in love with the niece of that wealthy master, Rose Velderkaust. She was younger than he, not quite 17, and all the soft dimpled charms of any of the fair, light-haired Flemish maidens seemed to have lighted upon her. Shulkin loved her honestly and fervently, and his frank adoration was rewarded after a time. He declared his love to her, and he elicited in response a faltering confession of her own love in return. Well, that made him, of course, the happiest painter in all of Christendom, but there was something to dash that elation, for he was poor and undistinguished, and he dare not ask Gerard Doe for her hand. So he first must win himself a reputation. Therefore, many dread uncertainties lay in the cold days before him, and there were sore odds stacked against his romance. But he had won the heart of Rose Velderkaust, and that was at least half of the battle. His exertions at his easel redoubled, and certainly his lasting celebrity have proved, at least in part, that great success of those efforts. But his labours and his hopes were destined to experience an interruption that was both strange and mysterious, and baffle inquiries, and that cast a shadow of preternatural horror over these hopes and dreams of romance. Now, Shulkin, one evening, was outstaying all of his fellow pupils, pursuing his work in the deserted art studio now. And the daylight was fading outside, so he laid aside his colours. Instead, he set upon completing a sketch, and was taking extraordinary pains about it. It was a religious composition, one of a pot-bellied St. Anthony, coping with temptations from the devil and the like. And Shulkin had enough discernment to have dissatisfaction with the work in hand, and the many erasures and improvements that he detailed against both the saint and the devil were all in vain. The room was silent, and save for he himself, it was emptied of its usual inhabitants. Well, an hour passed, and then two, and there was no improvement to the result. The daylight was declining, and the twilight was deepening outside into night. Shulkin's patience was quite exhausted. He stood before his unfinished work, angry and mortified, one hand buried deep into his long hair, and the other holding the charcoal that had ill performed its office. He now rubbed away with it without much regard of the sable streaks it produced. Curse the subject, curse the picture, curse the devil and the saint. At that moment, Shulkin heard a sniff somewhere behind him, only a yard and a half away. It made him turn sharply around, and he now became aware that his labours had been overlooked by a stranger. This stranger, who stood in a cloak and a broad-brimmed hat, with heavy gauntlets upon his hands, clasping an ebony walking stick with a massive head of gold upon the top of it. He was draped in a rich chain of the same metal. and the room was so obscure and dark that nothing further could be ascertained, for the hat threw shadows across the features. Now, it was not easy to conjecture the age of the intruder, but some dark hair from beneath the sombre hat, and the firm, upstanding bearing and gait of the figure, suggested that his years could not exceed threescore or thereabouts. The man had an air of gravity and importance, and he was in the garb of a person of some standing, yet there was something indescribably odd, I might say awful, about his perfect, stone-like stillness. It checked the testy comment that rose to the lips of the startled painter, and once he had recovered himself and his surprise, he asked the stranger, as civilly as he could manage, if he wished to be seated, or if he had any message for his master to be relayed. "Tell Gerardo," said the unknown, and not altering his attitude at all, and certainly not sitting down, "that Mynheer van der Hausen of Rotterdam desires to speak with him tomorrow evening at this hour in this room on matters of weight, and that is all." Well, the stranger finished his strange message and turned, and with a silent step quit the room. Before Shulkin had said any word of reply, the man was gone. Shulkin had a curiosity of which direction this fellow might head once he had quit the rooms of the studio. And so he went across to the window, which commanded the view over the door. There was a lobby of considerable extent just outside, and it would have been impossible for the burgher of Rotterdam to quit the building before he established his place of observation. But he watched in vain, however, for no one exited the building, and there was no other door than that. But had the old man vanished? I mean, or was he lurking somewhere in the recesses of the lobby for some sinister purpose or other? This all filled Shulkin with a vague uneasiness, which was unaccountably intense. He was quite afraid to remain in the room alone, and yet he was even more reluctant to pass through the lobby in the direction of that odd gentleman. But with an effort that was disproportionate to the occasion, finally he summoned up a resolution to quit the room. He locked the door behind him and thrust the key in his pocket. Then, crossing the passageway, looking neither left nor right, he scarcely ventured to breathe until he was outside into the open, empty street. He still did not see in which direction the man had gone. Well, "Mynheer van der Hausen," said Gerardo to himself, as the appointed hour of their meeting the next day approached. "Mynheer van der Hausen of Rotterdam. I have never heard the name till yesterday. Oh, what can he want? Perhaps he is having some portrait painted, or some poor relation apprenticed. Perhaps he wishes a collection valued, or what? No, there is no one in Rotterdam who would leave me a legacy. Well, whatever business it is, we shall soon know it all." Now it was close to the close of day, and again every easel within the studio, save that of Shulkin, was deserted. Gerardo paced restlessly about the room, giving a glance to a canvas here and there, and more than one glance out of the window to see passers-by in the obscure street that led up to his studio. But he did not see this strange figure that Shulkin had described. "Said you not, Godfrey, that he said the appointed hour was 7 by the clock of the Stadthouse?" "Just so. He told me 7 when I saw him, sir." "Well, the hour is close at hand, then. and the man consulted a horologe large as an orange from his pocket. Meneer van der Hausen of Rotterdam, is this so? Well, such was the name he gave me. An elderly man, richly clad, you say? Well as I might see, he's not old or not so young either. Dress that was rich and grave and becoming a citizen of wealth and consideration. That moment, the sonorous boom of the Stadthouse clock struck out the hour of 7, and the eyes of both master and student turned toward the door at the last peal of the bell. Ah, we shall have his worship presently if he means to keep his hour. If not, you must wait up for him. Whatever it is he proves to wish, I think it might simply be a mummery by Van der Kaap or some other wag. I wish you had run all of the risks and cudgelled this burgomaster more soundly. I will wager a dozen to Rhenish that his worship would have been unmasked and pleaded to just be some old acquaintance playing some kind of trick. I think he would have unmasked in a trice. He comes, sir, said Schalken back to his master. And indeed, his master turned to the door, and Gerardo observed the same figure that had greeted Schalken the night before. He was satisfied at once that there was no masquerading in this case. He was in the real presence of a man of wealth and standing and power, a man of worship. And so he doffed his cap at once and offered up a seat to the visitor, but the visitor waved the offer away, remained standing. Do I have the honor of seeing Meneer van der Hausen of Rotterdam? The same, was the only reply. Well, I believe you wish to speak to me. I am here to await your commands. Is that a man of trust? Well, he indicated young Schalken, who was seated directly behind his master. Well, certainly. Then let him take this box to the nearest jeweler or goldsmith and have a value of its contents and return with a certificate of valuation. Well, the case that he spoke of was about 9 inches square, and he placed it into the artist's hands. Gerardo was amazed by the weight and by the abruptness of the stranger. Well, he gave the box to Schalken and relayed the direct message given to him and set him about the mission. Schalken placed the box under his cloak, quit the building, traversed some 2 or 3 narrow streets until he approached the corner house of a Jewish goldsmith. He entered the shop, calling the man forth from these recesses, and he laid out Meneer van der Hausen's casket, and they examined it together by the lamplight. It was cased in lead that had gone white with age. When they removed the lead and saw that within there was a box of hard wood, opening that, there were folds of linen that they drew to one side and found within a mass of gold ingots. They were closely packed, and the goldsmith declared of perfect quality. Every ingot underwent scrutiny, and with an Epicurean's delight, the goldsmith had tested each morsel of the glorious metal. Mein Gott, how perfect! Not one grain of alloy. Beautiful, beautiful. The task being completed, he certified their worth at being many thousands of Rixdollars. Well, Schalken, having got the desired document, placed it in his pocket and placed the box of gold under one arm, concealed both with his cloak, and retraced his footsteps back to the studio of his master. He found both of them in close conference. Whilst he had been away, there had been much discussion between the two figures. I cannot tarry tonight more than a few minutes, and I will tell you, therefore, upon the matter of which I have come. You visited Rotterdam some months ago, and I saw at the Church of St. Lawrence your niece, Rose Veldecoust. I desire to marry her, and if I should satisfy you that I am a wealthier man than any husband who could dare dream to expect her hand, well, I expect you to forward my suit to her. And if you approve, I wish you to close here and now, for I cannot wait calculations and delays. Well, Girardot was astonished, but did not venture to express his surprise at this request. Out of prudence and politeness, of course, but also out of a chill oppression in the presence of this man that was rather undefined, but an overpowering sensation in him. This eccentric stranger who stood before him, he was most unwilling to offend. Well, no doubt it would be an advantageous and honorable match to my niece, but you must understand that she has a will of her own, and she may not acquiesce to this design, even if it be to her advantage. Do not seek to deceive me, Master Painter, for you are her guardian. She is your ward, and she will be mine if you would make her so. Well, the stranger moved forward toward Girardot at that moment, and he found himself praying in that moment for Shulkin's swift return. I desire to place in your hands evidence of my wealth and standing as a security, and you will see I will be most liberal in my dealing with your niece. Once your lad will return, you will see that I will place 5 times the sum that you could expect of any husband, and this will lie in your hands, and you may keep her dowry, and you may place the 2 sums together, and you may place it toward suiting her interest in any way she may wish. Am I not liberal? Well, Girardot certainly assented that this was most kind towards his niece, and it was very wealthy and generous. It was not an offer to be despised, for Rose only had a modest dowry, and her own origins were far from splendid, it must be said. But there were other objections, perhaps, towards this match, but Girardot did not listen to them at this time. Sir, I mean, the offer is most liberal, but my hesitation is on simply not knowing your family, your station. Upon those grounds, would you be able to satisfy me? My respectability you must take for granted, sir. But I will not have you pester me with any further inquiries. You will discover no more of me than I choose to make plain to you. And my security to you will be my word if you are honorable, or if you are sordid, it will be my gold. Well, this was a rather testy old gent, thought Girardot. He must have his own way, but I'm not justified in declining, and I'd not rather pledge myself unnecessarily, however. You would not pledge yourself unnecessarily. That was very strange. How did the man say that? As if he plucked the very thought out of Girardot's mind. Well, but will, if necessary, presume, I am sure, that I shall show indispensable that you make your decision here and now. If you wish to have my gold, and you do not wish this proposal withdrawn at once, then you must write your name to this engagement here and now. Well, thus spoken, the man produced a paper and shuffled it into Girardot's hands. It was detailing giving Roosevelt de Kuyt to Meneer van der Hausen of Rotterdam in marriage, so on and so forth. And all of this was to be achieved within 1 week. There was to be no delay to the matrimony. Well, whilst he was studying the document, Shulkin returned from his errand and delivered the box along with its valuation to his master. Doe inspected both of them. "Are you not content, Herr Painter?" Well, Gerardo wished for a day or so to consider. "Not an hour, not a minute will you have." "Well, in that case, I am content to the bargain. Then sign at once, for I am weary." Gerardo signed the bargain. "Let this youth also be a witness unto the covenant." Well, that moment, Godfrey Shulkin unconsciously attested to the instrument that would bereft him of his dear Rose Veldecoust from then and forever. Once the document was completed, signed, and witnessed, the stranger folded it and stowed it away in some inner pocket or other. "I shall visit tomorrow at your own lodgings at 9 o'clock, so that I might see the object of our contract." And with this, Van der Hausen moved stiffly but rapidly from the room. Shulkin was eager to resolve his doubts about the fellow, how he had vanished strangely the last time he had approached. So he went back to that same window, but the old man did not issue from the door this time either. This was strange but also fearful. Shulkin and his master returned together from the studios. They talked little, for each had their own anxieties and hopes that they were playing in their minds. Shulkin, at that moment, did not know the ruin that menaced his dearest hopes and projects, and Gerardo knew nothing of the attachment between his pupil and his niece, though even if he had known, it probably would have presented no serious obstruction, for marriages of that day and age were a matter of traffic and calculation. It would be absurd to consider love in a matter of finance. But the painter didn't communicate to his niece, at least not at once, the steps that he had taken upon her behalf. This was not from fear of any objection, but simply because it would be ludicrous if Rose asked him if he could describe the bridegroom that he would not be able to at all, because the man's face had remained within the shadows of his hat at all times. Well, the next day he called his niece unto him. "Rose, my girl, that face of yours will make your fortune, and such faces and tempers rarely go together. And when they do, it is a compound that is a love charm that few can resist. And I will promise you this, I am sure that you are soon to be a bride. Now, you must make ready the large room of the house for 8 o'clock, and we will have supper prepared for 9 o'clock. I am expecting a friend, and I wish you to trick yourself out handsomely, for I would not have him think of us as poor or worthless." Now, he left her to oversee these preparations, whilst he went to oversee his pupils and their efforts as evening closed in. Well, Gerard called Shulkin. He was about to leave towards his own lodgings, and he asked the young apprentice whether or not he would come and sup with their company that evening. Of course, Shulkin at once accepted, for it meant a chance of a glimpse of young Rose. Well, they retired to the antique chamber of Dow's house. Now, All preparations had been made for the comfort of the stranger, and a fire blazed. Now, there was present Rose, her uncle, and the young apprentice, and all of them awaited the approach of the stranger. 9 o'clock came at length, and there was a very heavy knock upon the door without. One of the domestics descended to it, and there was a heavy tread upon the stair. The door slowly opened. The figure that it revealed startled them. It startled and appalled the phlegmatic Dutchman within the room, and for Rose, well, it almost drove from her lips a scream of terror. It was the form of Mynheer van der Hausen. It had the same air, the same gait that had greeted the artists before, but his features had never been visible before. Now, he stood before them in the light of the fire. He was wearing dark sable clothing. He had heavy, gauntlet-like gloves upon his hands, and clutched once again his walking stick in his hands. But in the other hand he had his hat, and so there was no shadow falling upon his face. There was a quantity of grizzled hair that fell in long tresses to a stiff ruff about his neck. But the face, that face, it was a bluish and leaden hue, such as metallic medicines can produce when given in excessive quantities. The eyes were a muddy white, and they had a character of insanity about them. Well, the hue of the lips, they were nearly black, and the whole character of the face, it was sensual, malignant, even satanic in nature. This worshipful stranger entered and approached, and it suffered as little as possible of its flesh to be seen and appear. It did not remove its gloves even once. It stood some long moments at the door. Girardot found at length his breath and enough collectedness to bid welcome to the visitor. But with that, it moved forwards into the room, and with a mute inclination of its head, it greeted the company. There was something indescribably odd, even horrible about its motions. Indefinable, unnatural, unhuman. You see, the limbs seemed guided and directed as if by a spirit unused to the management of bodily machinery. The fellow spoke hardly at all. In fact, within the whole half hour of its visit, it barely even spoke. His host scarcely spoke, indeed at all, for he hardly found the courage necessary to be able to conduct the salutations and courtesies of any decent host. Such was the nervous terror that the form of Mynheer van der Hausen provoked in those seated in front of him. In fact, it would have taken very little for all of his entertainers to have fled in terror from the room. But they were not so lost in their self-possession as to not observe two peculiar instances. Mynheer van der Hausen's eyes did not close, not even once, nor did they seem to move and look about. And beyond that, there was a death-like stillness about the man. I mean, there was no heaving of breath to his chest. Now, that might seem a trifle to observe, but it was most striking in the unpleasantness that it caused. At length, Mynheer van der Hausen left. He had not dined with the others, but departed, and gave no trifling sense of relief when he quit the door. Rose was the first to speak. "Dear uncle, That frightful man I would not see again for all the wealth of all of the states. Tush, my foolish girl, a man may be as ugly as the devil, and yet if his heart and his actions are true, well, they will more than make up for all the perfumed puppies that walk in the mall. I mean, I know it was not a pretty face, but he is both wealthy and liberal. Well, those qualities would make up if he were 10 times as ugly. Those two virtues are truly strong and would counterbalance all deformities. Uncle, honestly, when I saw that man, I could think of nothing but that painted wooden figure that is there within the Church of St. Lawrence in Rotterdam. Well, here, Gerardo laughed at the justness of the comparison. The fellow did somewhat resemble that effigy that was in that particular church of Rotterdam. Yet he was resolved to dissuade his niece from dwelling upon that man's ugliness, for there were better qualities to consider. Gold, for one. The next day, presents from all across the town of Leyden arrived at their door. Silks and velvets and jewels. And there were a packet of papers also, and these were given over into the hand of Gerardo himself. And they settled a rather incredible sum of money for the finalization of the contract of marriage. Now, I have no sentimental scenes to describe to you now. Nothing about the cruelty of the guardians, of how they acted, or indeed the agonies of the transportation of lovers split apart. No, the record I have here is one of simple, sordid calculation, of levity, of heartlessness. Within a week, the contract was fulfilled, and Schalken saw that prize that he would have risked his entire existence to secure was carried off and away from him in solid pomp by his repulsive rival. Well, he took some 2 to 3 days to absent himself from his school, but then he returned back to his work, and he worked once again with a dogged resolution. For the stimulus of love driving his work was not there any longer, and it was replaced by a bitter ambition. Well, months passed, and Gerardo had not heard anything from his niece, not since she had travelled to Rotterdam, and none of her monies from the banks had been drawn, which was strange. Surely she had some expenses, despite her husband's liberality. This led Gerard to feel extremely uneasy, and so uneasy, in fact, that he travelled and made his own way to Rotterdam to check upon his ward, his niece. But when he arrived there, no one at all within the whole city of Rotterdam seemed to have heard of Mynheer van der Hausen, and Gerard made not a single inquiry, but left no house in the whole Boom Key untried. Well, all of his efforts were in vain, and he had to return to Leyden none the wiser, and certainly a good deal more anxious than when he left. Well, he went to the establishment that he knew Mynheer van der Hausen had hired a luxury carriage to take them all the way to Rotterdam, and he asked the driver how that journey had gone. The driver said that they had approached the city late on in the evening, but about a mile from it they had stopped, for standing within the road there had been a collection of somberly dressed men, and they stood there, all in an old fashion of dress, with peaked beards and strange moustaches, and they stood there, obstructing the road and bearing with them a litter. Well, the driver, of course, reined in his horses, fearing the obscurity of the hour and indeed the loneliness of the road. He thought that there was some mischief intended, but, in fact, his passengers quit the carriage, Mynheer van der Hausen opening the door and drawing after him his bitterly crying bride. She was weeping and wringing her hands, and the two of them entered the litter, and the gentlemen raised it in their hands, and by that means they proceeded toward the city. The darkness concealed them from his view swiftly enough, and the coachman found within the coach a purse that more than thricely paid for the hire. So he returned back to Leyden. He saw nothing more of Mynheer van der Hausen, or indeed the beautiful lady at his side. This mystery was a great deal of a source of anxiety for Gerard Doe. Indeed, it was a source of grief for him. There had been some kind of fraud within this dealing that he could not understand, and every day that went past that he did not hear from his niece compounded the matter upon him. It depressed his spirits, and so, to dispel the gloom, he often invited young Schalken home with him, so that he might share the supper with someone at least. One night, seated by the fireside, after a good meal and in the melancholy of digestion, the two of them were disturbed by a sound from the street below, a banging at the door, a sound of rushing and scrambling against it. One of the domestics descended and inquired 2 or 3 times at the door, but got no answer as to who was without. At length they opened the door, and the gentleman upstairs heard a soft tread flying up the staircase and casting open the door toward their chamber. Sweet Rose rushed into the room. She looked wild and fierce, and she was haggard with terror and exhaustion. Her dress, too, surprised them as much as her appearance, for she wore a white woolen wrapper about her throat that descended all the way down toward the ground, and this was much deranged and muddied from travel. But the poor creature fell practically senseless to the floor, and with some difficulty they revived her. "Wine, wine, I must have wine quickly, or I am lost." Well, they were astonished and scared by the agitation within her voice, and at once they fetched the wine for her. She drank most heartily, and with the same urgency she said, "Food, please, for God's sakes, I must have food, or I shall perish." Well, there had been the remains of the roast joint upon the table. Schalken began to carve from it, but fair Rose gripped it, and like the very image of famine, she began to tear at it with her hands and with her teeth. Well, when the first paroxysms of hunger seemed to be at least a little assuaged, well, she wept bitterly in Schalken's arms. "Send for a minister, please, a minister of God. I must have him. I am not safe until he comes." Well, Gerard Doe at once sent one of his servants for the minister and offered his bedchamber to his niece so that she might rest. She agreed, but only if they would not leave her side, not for a moment. Oh, that that holy man were here, that he could deliver me. The dead and the living can never be as one. God has forbidden it. And with those odd words, she surrendered into their guidance. "Do not leave me, please, for a moment. I am lost if you do." Well, they crossed the large chamber towards Gerard Doe's inner lodgings, towards his bedroom. He and Schalken carried candles with them to reach toward the bedchamber, but as they approached, Rose stopped, and, thrilled with horror in her voice, She whispered, "Oh God, he is here! I can see him! See him ahead! There he goes!" Well, she pointed toward the door of the inner room, and Shulkin almost thought he saw some kind of shadow, ill-defined, gliding into the apartment. He drew his sword, and he raised the candle in his hand. Entering, throwing the light ahead of him, he could see that there was no figure there. There was nothing but furniture, but surely something had moved before him. Well, sickening with dread, there came cold perspiration upon Shulkin's forehead, and he heard Rose's voice once again. "I saw him. He's here. I cannot be deceived. I know him. He's by me. He's in the room. Oh, for God's sakes, as you would save me, do not stir from my side." They prevailed upon her to get upon the bed and to lie down and calm herself. She did so, but still uttering these strange and incoherent sentences. "The dead and the living cannot be as one. The rest to the wakeful, and sleep to the sleepwalkers." Well, these and other mysterious broken sentences she spoke all the time until the clergyman at last arrived. Now, Girardot feared that this terror in his niece was perhaps from some ill treatment. Perhaps it had unsettled the girl's intellect, for her appearance and her whole demeanor seemed as if one who had escaped the confines of a lunatic asylum. Well, he resolved to seek medical advice as soon as there was some measure of calm restored, perhaps that the clergyman might be able to bring to his niece. He did not wish to question her any further, for it might revive some horrible memories that had unseated her intellect at first. The clergyman had arrived, and he was of a venerable age and disposition. He entered the outer chamber, and immediately Rose requested that he pray for her, as he might pray for one who lays in the hands of Satan himself, with only the hope of deliverance from heaven. Well, so that you may now distinctly understand the scene I am about to describe, you must understand the circumstances of the event. I wish to lay out the relative positions of the figures. You see, the old clergyman and Shulkin were both outside in the anteroom, whereas Rose lay within, in the inner chamber upon the bed, and by her side was her uncle, Doe. Now, as she lay there, the clergyman took a breath, as if about to begin his prayers for her, and in that moment, a breath of wind, it seemed, blew out the candle which was on the bedside beside the girl. Now, Rose cried out at once, "Godfrey, bring in a candle. The darkness for me, it is unsafe." Now, at that moment, Girardot, forgetting all of the injunctions his niece had placed upon him from stepping from her side, did just that. He stepped away from her bedside just to go and fetch a candle for her from the other room. But she cried out, "Oh God, uncle, do not leave me. Do not leave me for a moment." She shrieked and stood to her feet, following after him, but it was too late, because even as he crossed the threshold of the room, the door slammed behind him, and it seemed only as if swung by a blast of wind. But as Shulkin and Girardot between them gripped a hold of the handle and pulled and wrenched with all their might, it would not give or budge an inch. And they heard shriek after shriek from the chamber within, the sounds of truly despairing terror. Now they pulled at the door, but all in vain. There was no sound of struggling from within. No, There was only the screams, but they increased in their loudness and their terror, and they heard from within the bolts of the lattice windows pulled back, the windows thrown open, and with one final scream that seemed scarcely human, there was a death-like silence from the chamber within. A light step could be heard, crossing the floor from the bed to the window, and in the same instant, the door gave way, and because of their energetic efforts, it cast both men into the room, which was empty. The window was open, and Shulkin sprung up onto a chair so that he might look out onto the street and the canal below. But he saw no form there, no figure, no person, though he thought he saw ring after ring spread in heavy circles upon the surface of the water of the canal. No trace of Rose Velderkaust was ever found, nor anything is certain about her mysterious wooer. No information of him was ever discovered, but one incident did occur. Some years later, in fact. It is hardly evidence of a scientific nature, but it certainly made a lasting impression upon Master Shulkin. Now, as I say, it was years later. It was the time of Shulkin's father's funeral, and because of this, he had to travel to Rotterdam, and he had arrived at the church of St. Lawrence, where his father was to be buried. It was late in the day, and he found it open and preparations being made for his father's funeral the next day. But the sexton greeted him and invited him to share the fireside, and Shulkin was exhausted from his travel upon the road, and of course the grief of his father's loss. Now he sank there into the chair, and the sexton couldn't get any useful conversation from him, so he shuffled off to smoke a pipe, and Shulkin faded away into slumber there by the warmth of the fire. He felt himself jostled awake, and he wondered if the sexton was beside him, but no, the man had left the room. There was a woman there, a woman dressed all in white, a garment that seemed to draw a veil down upon her face, and he could not make out her form, but she carried a lamp, and she moved away from him towards the stairs of the vaults. He had a feeling of alarm at seeing her, but an impulse of interest to follow her all at once, and so he did, down those stairs towards the vaults. And when they reached the vault, the figure paused, looked back towards him, and by the light of the lamp that she carried, he saw the face of Rose Velderkaust. He saw the face of his first and only love. There was nothing sad or horrible in her countenance. She wore the same arch smile that she had often used to enchant him in their happier days together. It was not like a day had passed, and feeling awe at the glimpse of her, he followed as she led on through a narrow passageway, and to his infinite surprise, instead of another vault, he found himself in an old-fashioned Dutch apartment, or such as the pictures of Gerard Dow immortalized. There was costly furniture all about, and a four-poster bed with heavy black curtains about it, and the figure turned towards him, wearing that same curious arch smile, and she drew aside the curtains of the heavy black velvet about that bed, and she held the lamp up high so that Shulkin might be able to see within. He peered close forwards, and it was revealed to Shulkin, in abject horror, within that bed, sitting bolt upright, was the figure of Mynheer van der Hausen, the livid, demoniac form of that man turning slowly towards him. But Shulkin barely saw this, for at once at the sight he fainted dead away. And he was found there, upon the floor, in the morning. He was discovered by those persons who were employed in enclosing the passages of the vaults, and he was found lying within a cell of some considerable size, in which there was an undisturbed tomb, a large coffin that was supported on small pillars as a prevention from the actions of vermin. The strange coffin that was placed exactly where he had seen the four-poster bed that he could have sworn he saw the night before. Well, to his dying day, Shulkin was certain of the reality of the vision that he saw, of the event that I have told you, and he left behind him curious evidence of it in that painting that I mentioned to you earlier. That painting that had all of the qualities of Shulkin's work, but is particularly valuable because it presents a portrait of the early love, Rose Veldecaust, whose mysterious fate, it must say, must always be a matter for speculation. Well, my friends, thank you once again for joining me for another Edwyrdian tale. It is wonderful to have the company of you all once again. Now, I must say we have a very busy Edwyrdian season coming up upon us, indeed, and in 2 weeks' time, you can join me once again. I will be telling a night of tales of M.R. James, a favourite of mine, as you all know. Now, I am not so often in the habit of repeating myself, but I'm telling 2 tales of his I have told once or twice before, Rats and Warning to the Curious, because this is the year of 100 years since the publication of one of Mr. James's most famous works. Now, if you are within stone's throw of London, of the Old Smoke, well, then you are welcome to also join me for a live performance of it at the Old Red Lion Theatre on the 17th of October. And indeed, coming up a little later in the year, in November and December, I have my Ghost Stories for Christmas tour, which will be touring about the entirety of the United Kingdom. But indeed, we do have many more of our tales over the ether in store for us over the coming weeks and months. Well, friends, thank you once again for joining me, and I bid you good night and the sweetest dreams. Thank you.